Chapter 21, Terms of Engagement. Terms of Engagement. A gnome drained the last of his ale and set his cup down to pour himself some more from the jug next to him, ignoring the bustle of the tavern around him as the other patrons took their noon meal. He was sat at their usual table in the coronet, Ari and Herr Dallas sat opposite. The bard leant back in his chair while the elf gazed up at him with a dreamy look as he told her yet another tale of sigil. A gnome sighed, his mind drifting back to his plans for the day and their ongoing search for the runaways. He had discussed the task with the others last night while Frithia and the bard had been off at her theatre, Jahara suggesting that the local Thieves Guild would likely be the best place to start if he intended to look for Lursand, and Frithia had encouraged him to arrange a meeting with the thief master once she had returned later that evening. He had agreed with them, and that morning's trip to the Thieves Guild had gone more smoothly than he had anticipated. Myrtle, the bright girl Frithia had instructed him to ask for, blithely telling him that Renal could give them a few moments that afternoon, just after the second bells, before bidding him a cheery farewell, and the three had returned to the inn to await the others. Speaking of which, a gnome glanced up to see a familiar pair stood in the doorway opposite, Jahara pointing their table out, and Frithia sent them a wave and a smile as they approached, which, a gnome noticed, only he and the bard returned.
"Hello,"
the girl greeted brightly as she sank into the empty chair next to him.
"How was the guild?"
"Dull," sighed Herr Dallas before a gnome could answer, the bard sending her a stern look as he continued.
"And not nearly as exciting as I had believed it would be from the description of your last visit."
Frithia looked as though she was trying very much not to laugh, putting all her focus into pouring herself some ale, and a gnome suspected she may have been trying to provoke some interest in the task from the bard with tales of their previous brawl.
"Ah, Carter and his friends not there, eh?"
she continued to him with an innocent smile, and a gnome shook his head.
"Thankfully, no. We have an appointment to see Renal this afternoon. How goes your investigation?"
Frithia shrugged mildly, turning to poor Jahara some ale as the druid answered him.
"We have still to identify the piece of leather we found on the body yesterday, but we may have a suspect in an old woman of the area who has been rumored to be practicing witchcraft. We plan to locate her this afternoon." "Then we looked in on Higold and the theatre,"
Frithia continued as she set the jug back down and took a drink herself.
"Signed off some bills for props and looked over the costumes they plan on using, though some of them were a bit worn. I might head over there later to help Win and Jenna with the repairs."
A gnome smiled into his cup. He would never get used to the idea of Frithia the seamstress.
"Which play are they actually planning to perform?"
he questioned politely, and the girl sighed.
"The Sorcerer's Bane, only please don't call it that in front of the troupe,"
she added earnestly.
"One of the stagehands, Ketrick, was talking my ear off when I was there today, about the curse that apparently surrounds it."
Jahara snorted, a wry smile pulling at her mouth.
"Of all the plays you had to choose from, you just had to pick one with a curse on it?" "Hey, don't lay this on me,"
Frithia countered sharply, a grin warming her tone.
"It was that fop, Higold, who chose it, and he didn't mention anything about a curse at the time either." "Well, what are you supposed to call it then?"
asked a gnome.
"What about the Frith's Bane?"
offered Herr Dallas mildly, and the girl in question snorted.
"Very funny. All the actors insist on calling it the Termish play." "The Termish play,"
came Ari tentatively, turning to the bard next to her.
"I don't think I've heard of it before. What's it about?"
Herr Dallas merely looked to Frithia though, and the elf had no choice but to follow suit as the girl answered her.
"It's a grand epic about the pride of a great sorcerer and the love that is his downfall, that is according to Higold anyway. I'm not so keen on it myself. You're not keen on it?
Came Ari with disbelief, seemingly before she could stop herself.
It's a masterpiece of tragic love. I didn't think you had heard of it before,
Frithla laughed, though the elf did not share her amusement, coloring to drop her eyes to her cup as the girl continued.
And, it is all right from what I have read. I just found some of the verses seem more concerned with keeping the pentameter and rhyme, than actually conveying the emotion of the scene. But plays aren't really my thing anyway.
She glanced to Herr Dallas.
What do you think? I have not studied the play myself, though a prime masterpiece it may be,
he confirmed, and in a tone that suggested such an accolade wasn't worth much.
It has yet to reach sigil.
Frithla smiled absently, taking another drink.
Well, you can borrow my copy of the script if you want to see what all the fuss is about. Ah, here come two welcome faces,
she called as the door slammed again and a gnomon glanced up to see Nalia and Minsk weaving their way over to them.
Any news? Well,
sighed Nalia glumly as they took the final 2 seats in between Frithla and Ari,
we have managed to find a day's work for a local goldsmith, but it does not start until tomorrow. Boo says it is better than nothing,
came Minsk, giving the girl's back a hardening pat that made her wince, the hamster in question watching Nalia from the ranger's shoulder, and Frithla sent her a kind smile.
I should listen to him, if I were you, and your timing's perfect,
she added with a laugh as the maid arrived to set a stack of dishes and large pot of soup in the center of their table, Jahara standing to ladle it out, and a gnomon let his eyes drift over the group as their meal began. Ari and Herr Dallas were deep in conversation once more, as were Nalia and Frithla, though the latter girl kept glancing over to the couple, Nalia leaning in to whisper something at her ear. The guilty way Frithla was laughing, giving him the impression may not have been very nice as she turned back to the dish Jahara had just set before her with a slight frown.
Isn't this the same soup they were serving yesterday?
Nalia gave the contents of her own bowl a tentative stir with the spoon.
No, I don't think so. That was chicken. I'm pretty sure this is pigeon. Really? I thought it was rabbit.
Countered Ari in a look he could not read past between the two girls, while Jahara muttered something about it probably being rat that reduced Frithla to a fit of laughter, the girl hiding her face behind her napkin until she had calmed down. A gnomon frowned as she finally quietened enough to be caught in conversation by the bard. He had noticed she had been in a very giggly mood at breakfast as well, and though he had thought the investigations into the bridge murders would sober her, it seemed he was mistaken, and her cheerful air was putting him very much in mind of his younger sister. Dear Moira. Every time he pictured the girl, Helena, his sister's form would swim into view, and he wondered absently whether Moira had ever planned the same to escape their father's drunken malice. But eventually he sighed and shook his head. Moira would never desert the man, and if she did, a gnomon would only spend his time worrying about the company she was keeping, or whether she was in trouble. At least she was safe at home, however unpleasant the arrangements may be. He must find the time to visit her soon.
A gnomon.
He glanced up to find Frithla watching him, Herr Dallas looking annoyed that her attention was and remained elsewhere as she continued gently.
Are you all right? You looked. Yes, I am fine, my lady,
he cut in before she had a chance to finish, almost in hope of irritating her into not pressing this concern further. She frowned slightly, but continued nevertheless, the bard already back in conversation with Ari.
Are you thinking on the runaway, Helena?
A gnomon nodded. He was surprised she had been able to tell.
Yes. How did you know?
The girl smiled wryly.
Well, I could only guess at she or Renal and you weren't frowning, so I went with the former. You are worried for her?
A little, he conceded with a sigh.
I know how anxious I would be if my sister ran away as she has. Yet, I am not sure who to believe in all this. Her parents are clearly distraught by her absence, yet the maid seemed in earnest. Could it be that Lursand tricked both her and Helenya in the sincerity of his feelings?
Fritha shrugged mildly.
Perhaps they are both telling the truth, at least, the truth as they see it. I find it is something very dependent on who is looking at it at the time. Do not try to decide yet. Speak to Renal, see if you can locate Lursand and just go from there.
Anomen smiled. Her words were nothing he did not know himself, but they were heartening to hear all the same. He glanced up as the distant chime of the temple bells echoed along the street outside.
The first bells. We should be leaving.
Fritha smiled fondly as he rose, Herr Dallas and Ari moving to do the same.
Give my best to Renal, won't you?
He frowned but nodded once.
My lady.
The docks were just as they had left them, narrow grim terraces all infused with the scent of fish and salt. Herr Dallas sighed to himself, watching the ships swaying in the harbor as they moved along the street, though it was not nearly as interesting as the temple district had been, and he was beginning to wonder if that place wasn't just the exception to the rule in Athkatla, the most consistent point of interest within the city so far being flirting with the girls. Though Ari seemed a little prone to jealousy, all silences and dark looks, her young innocence was captivating, like a flower just waiting to be coaxed into bloom. And perhaps she was not as unworldly as she was happy to let him believe, but even that held an appeal of its own, the girl expressing a continuing interest in his thoughts and opinions that was flattering. And then there was Fritha, who despite his best efforts, remained as stoic as a stone when it came to his attempts to trick some hint of jealousy or affection from her, the girl doing nothing that would seem out of place in any friendship, and he was beginning to wonder whether she even thought of him as anything more. His mind drifted back to the last meal they had shared together. One moment they were engaged in an in-depth discussion on the crucial turning point of the play, Hugo Lith, she arguing it occurred with the protagonist's discovery of incest within the family history, he maintaining it was with his sister's marriage to his rival, when the squire suddenly got a more dour than usual look upon his face and she put it all aside to counsel him. Fritha and the Nightling's relationship was innocuous enough, Herr Dallas was sure, but the moment had illustrated for him quite clearly that she had other responsibilities within that group, and with her friend stolen and work to find, he would not be her priority. Realis had been the same, her writing and then the troupe taking up her time and thought, and he frowned as he considered the unfavorable comparison his unconscious had just made. He was not a superstitious man, but it was a bad omen nevertheless. Indeed, should he ever manage to get past the formalities of custom she seemed to have hidden herself behind and begin a relationship, she would no doubt expect more of him for it. But perhaps it would be worth it, he considered, letting her face swim into view, bright and passionate as they had discussed the play. Apart from the obvious attractions she held, Fritha had secrets in those dark eyes of hers, and ones that could prove all the more rewarding for his having to work for them. They had reached the guild building by now, just as plain and grey as it had been that morning, though the dark clouds that now hung overhead did give a more ominous feel to the place, and next to him Ari shivered, the girl pulling her cloak about her more tightly. Herr Dallas nodded slightly to himself, the air was cooler than it had been and he could smell rain in the air, not that either bothered him, and he wondered absently how much of Ari's discomfort came from the change in weather. He sent her a smile which she returned tentatively, and together the three entered the guild. Inside, a Nomen stepped forward immediately to collar a passing thief.
I would speak with Myrtle.
he commanded, adding a please after a pause, the squire clearly undecided as to whether manners conveyed a respect of others or respect for oneself. The man nodded once and disappeared, Herr Dallas letting his attention drift as he and Ari waited in the gloom behind him. The Thieves Guilt. He had at first been expecting something more like a fated stronghold, a place of ruthless climbing and violence, but reality had found it ran with the same mild order as Merchants' Guild, with people coming in and out, reporting on their tasks and paying their fees, a scattering of clerks recording it all. Frith's tale of threats and fights at breakfast had certainly made the place seem a lot more dangerous. The girl knew how to catch his imagination already, and use it to her advantage, though whether he was pleased by this, he was not sure. Mild though the place was, Ari still looked wary though, sending a scowl to the small group of thieves sat on some crates just right of the door who had paused in their game of cards to look her over, the elf seeming to shrink visibly into her cloak as they laughed quietly. She had been the same that morning, and it was clear she did not feel as comfortable working with the guild as perhaps some of the others. In fact, she and Anoman seemed the only ones wholly opposed to the place, and the bard felt himself smiling at the twist of fate that had sent them there. Ari, though, could not see the irony in it, it seemed, and he took a step closer to her, tugging the corner of her cloak so she faced him and turned her back on the thieves that so distressed her.
"You are anxious, my dove," he began,
sending her a reassuring smile as he continued.
"I understand your reluctance, but it is the most sensible path to the information we seek."
He paused a moment before adding gently,
"I can tell the Nightling we will await him outside though, if you cannot bear to stay."
She merely shook her head though, an almost childlike determination creasing her brow, and he nearly laughed, throwing an arm about her shoulders and feeling quite gratified as she leaned into the gesture. She trusted him to protect her, drew comfort from his presence, and he could not help recalling Frith's horror when he had presumed to lay hands on her in the theatre. She never would have allowed him to soothe her so, he was always to be kept at a friendly distance. The bard snorted wryly to himself as he released the elf. He suspected Fritha would not even have admitted to being frightened, hiding her feelings behind one of her many masks. She kept them all at a distance in that. The warm and gentle Ari, or the distant, but ever fascinating Fritha. A decision would have to be made soon, which path to travel, which one to pursue, for it was unkind to string both along indefinitely and not his intention. Such people ended up losing both quarries and more besides, he had been that fool once and once was enough. But the matter of which path to walk still remained.
"This way please,"
came a voice before him. Herr Dallas, glancing up to see the young thief, Myrtle, stood before them, and he could not resist giving her a wink, the bright girl giggling pleasantly as she turned to lead them up the stairs behind her and along a narrow hallway to a small office. The man he assumed to be Renal sat behind his desk, sharp-eyed and lithe even in his age, his smile as insincere as his genial surprise.
"Ah, members of Frith's merry band, is it?"
he greeted as they entered, resealing the scroll he had been looking over and turning his attention to them as they lined before him.
"Let us see, Anoman, Ari and—"
The thief's eyes narrowed as they fell on him, clearly trying to marry him with one of descriptions he had of their company.
"A new addition,"
Renal concluded eventually.
"I hope fairly new as well, or I shall have to have words with my agents." "And you are?" "This sparrow,"
Herr Dallas confirmed with some affected surprise of his own, bowing politely as he answered,
"Herr Dallas of Sigil. Fritha sends you her warmest regards."
He added, merely for the pleasure of seeing the Nightling's irritation. He was not disappointed. The thief's smile widened though, suddenly genuine, and for all his falseness, Herr Dallas could see he held a true regard for the girl.
"Ah, Fritha, such a pleasant young lady, understands the importance of the niceties,"
he continued in a sterner tone, as though to point out that they did not.
"I assume since she is not present, you are looking for information rather than imparting it?"
He sighed slightly.
Well, though I am beginning to regret what has been a rather one-sided alliance so far, a deal is a deal. What can I do for you three?
A no-man began at once, his tone clipped and lifeless.
We are looking for a thief, a young man named Lursand. Ah, say no more,
Renal interrupted genially.
I cannot help you.
The squire frowned.
He is not a member of the guild.
Renal shook his head, smiling blandly.
No, or I should say he is no longer. The boy stopped tithing about a 10-day or so ago now. I assumed he had defected to this rival guild with so many others. Distressing.
The man sighed affectedly,
but only as a symptom of a greater ill. The boy himself was just a pickpocket, and no real loss. So,
the thief continued, standing as he spoke, and Herr Dallas could sense their audience was at an end.
I suggest you begin searching for this other guild if you wish to find him, and of course, should you find anything,
Renal smiled broadly,
please be sure to let me know.
Ari pulled her cloak about her more tightly, a cool breeze blowing in from the sea as they made their way from the docks back to the coronet, a no-man silent and brooding at their head, which she could understand for the meeting had hardly been helpful, while Herr Dallas was next to her, whistling a tune to himself as they walked, and she sent him a smile. Though the bard, unlike a no-man, did not seem to care much that they worked with the thieves, he had been understanding of her apprehension, and she felt warm as she recalled his unexpected kindness towards her back at the guild, the feel of his arm about her lingering in her memory still. For her part, Ari was just glad to be out of there and away from Renal's watchful eye. Frith's account had painted a far more alluring picture of the thief than Ari had encountered, the man just as cold and ruthless but without the compassion the girl attributed to him, every word he seemed to utter somehow sounding like a veiled threat, the thief's dark gaze never resting anywhere over long. And it seemed it had been all for naught anyway. The boy was no longer a member of the guild, though that idea in itself pleased her, and she could not help dwelling on the rather romantic possibility that he had given up his life of dishonesty and run away to make a fresh start with his love. But, wonderful though that would be, it still left them with no clue as to where to find the couple. Ari smiled to herself. They always used to get a few in the circus, children with their hearts set on running away with them for the life of a performer. Very few made it past a day before they realized the life was not for them, though some lasted long enough that their parents came to fetch them. Hardly any survived a whole season though, with the days of traveling and performance after performance. It was a hard life, but one not without its rewards, and Ari felt an unexpected longing for her former home. Perhaps they could turn their investigations there if nothing else presented itself, just to rule it out as a possibility, however unlikely. They had reached the inn by now, Herr Dallas sweeping in to hold the door open for her with a gallant bow that made her laugh and a no-man frown. Inside, Nalia and Minsk were still at the table, sat just where they had left them over 2 hours ago, the pair glancing up as they arrived and calling a greeting, though Ari noticed the girl avoided her eye. The three joined them, and it seemed they had barely got settled and ordered drinks themselves when rain began to pat lightly against the grimy window next to them, steadily growing heavier, and the tavern about them began to fill, the air growing humid as more and more people entered to escape the storm. And it was not long after that when the final pair of their group arrived back, Fritha and Jahara appearing at the door, both cloaked against the rains and looking flushed and breathless from what had clearly been a brisk pace back from the bridge. Jahara headed straight for the stairs, but Fritha walked across to them, drawing back her hood and shaking the rain from the curls on her forehead.
Hello, I'm going to the bar, anyone else for wine? Say so and I'll get a bottle.
Nods of assent, and the girl slipped off her cloak, hanging it over one of the empty chairs before moving off to the crowded bar, and Ari felt her eyes follow her. Though it had been playfully done, Ari had thought it unkind of Fritha to draw attention to her ignorance, or lack thereof, concerning the play that noon, and the elf felt with growing certainty that it had been a sign of the girl's hidden esteem for the bard. Ari sighed, feeling her embarrassment resurfacing as she recalled it. She did not mean to play the ingenue, but she liked Herr Dallas so much, she just wanted to talk to him, have him tell her things, anything to grow closer to the man. The elf glanced up to see Fritha weaving her way back through the crowded tables, returning more quickly than she would have expected with a large bottle of dark crimson liquid under her arm, her hands filled with extra cups.
Okay, who'd like some?
It turned out all but Minsk, and Ari watched the bard watch Fritha as the girl handed the bottle to a gnomon to open while she passed around the cups she had brought.
Nalia. A gnomon. Ari. Thank you,
she replied as she received the small earthenware cup, feeling unsure of how to act around her now, and the girl smiled in reply, looking just as uncertain.
You're welcome. And lastly, the sparrow, ah.
Fritha continued, passing Herr Dallas his cup and jerking back her hand with a cry as a glint of static flashed between them.
We made a spark, my raven,
he grinned.
There must be a storm in the air.
Fritha laughed, collecting the bottle back from a gnomon to serve each of them some wine before sinking into the chair next to Minsk, taking a brief sip and opening her mouth as though to continue to the bard, Ari interrupting before she could stop herself.
So, how goes your investigation?
Well, began Fritha, once over her surprise,
we found the old woman easily enough, but it soon became apparent after talking to her she was by no means a murderer. And then it started hoying down.
She continued with a nod to the window and Ari assumed she was referring to the rain,
so we made a strategic retreat back here. Jahara wants to return tonight and look for a prostitute who apparently found one of the bodies. So,
she continued, taking another mouthful of wine as she glanced around the table,
what did Renal have to say? That you were a pleasant young lady for a start,
Herr Dallas began with a bark of laughter and Fritha looked delighted.
Really? He actually said that?
She cried incredulously, flushing with pleasure as he nodded and Ari frowned. A gnomon was right, the girl really did hold the thief master in too high a regard. Across the table, the squire's eyes had narrowed as well, Fritha seeming to notice and self-consciously tidying her hair as she turned politely to him.
And what did he say of Lursand?
A gnomon straightened in his chair to answer her.
That the boy stopped tithing some time ago and he believes him to be one of many who have deserted for this new guild. He suggests we turn our investigations on them.
Fritha shrugged mildly, emptying her cup and moving to pour herself some more wine.
Oh, well. Where do you plan to look next? Avis, the maid, said he and Helena used to meet at a tavern in the west of the docks, near to where the Cornwells used to live. I would suggest we try there after sunset, perhaps find some of their mutual acquaintances who are as worried for them as she.
He glanced about for support of this plan and Ari nodded her agreement. She would have never suspected one who could act so zealously to have such an analytical mind, but a gnomon was really quite good at this.
A fine idea,
Fritha concluded with a nod, turning instantly back to Herr Dallas, eager and bright.
So what else did Renal say?
The man laughed and Ari frowned, though more irritated by his apparent amusement than Fritha's interest in the guild master.
Really, Fritha, you speak as though you are enamored on the man,
she countered, instantly wishing she had managed to soften the sharpness of her tone, but it hardly mattered anyway, Fritha just laughing merrily and everyone at the table seemed eager to hear her reply as she finished another mouthful, playfully tapping her chin as though considering the point.
Well, I cannot deny he's wearing well for his age, and he's always very charming when I go and visit him. My lady!
Admonished a Noman as Herdalis and Nalia laughed, but even the good-natured Minsk did not seem to find amusement in the jest, shaking his bald tattooed head gravely.
Who does not think this a good match, young Fritha? Oh, I'm only joking, Minsk,
she smiled, patting his arm kindly. Renal's very nice, but no, Ari, I don't think I'll be suggesting we
further our alliance, so to speak. But you cannot deny he is agreeable.
She continued with a sigh, eyes gaining a distant look as she clearly pictured the man.
All polite and charming on the surface, but then you look at his eyes, so sharp and dark.
And Renal wasn't the only one with dark eyes, it seemed. A Noman scowling across the table at the girl, and Ari felt suddenly sad as she recalled the time when she and Fritha had teased him similarly over Kuldorn. They had been good friends, and she wondered again whether what she hoped to gain with Herdalis was worth what she could lose. Or had already lost, Ari considered darkly as her gaze fell to Nalia, and she pulled her mind away to take her first sip of wine, the liquid sour and almost oily, leaving her mouth drier than before she had drunk it. No wonder Fritha was on to her third cup, the elf reflected with a sourness that rivaled the wine as the girl continued, oblivious to it all.
Renal reminds me of that piece, The Walk of the Magi, have you heard it?
Fritha questioned, to no one in particular.
The melody is warm and full, all strings and horns, but then in the refrain there is a piccolo, bright and sharp like the eye of a bird.
The girl laughed brightly to herself, and Ari frowned. Fritha looked alive and vivid when she lost herself like this, and the elf was not the only one to have noticed either, Herdalis watching the girl darkly from across the table as she spoke.
Isn't it strange? I mean, it's called The Walk of the Magi, so I'm sure it's supposed to conjure up an image of something at least vaguely magical, and whenever I look it over, all I can see is Renal Blood Scalp.
Herdalis smiled broadly, and Ari fancied it held a hungry look.
I'm sure he would be charmed to know you thought as such, my raven. Indeed, after your description, I am intrigued to hear the piece myself.
But the girl just waved his words away with an absent sweep of her hand.
Oh, I'll have the sheet music kicking about somewhere, remind me to dig it out for you.
Nalia rolled her eyes, clearly cursing this missed opportunity, and Ari smiled in spite of herself. Whether a rival or not, it was difficult to stay angry with one as artless as Fritha. Herdalis had joined her discussion now, trying to find some common ground.
Have you heard Monsoon by Yuka? No, I don't think. What about The Great Feud?
He continued before she could finish, the girl's face lighting with an instant recognition.
Oh yes, but I don't understand how it's supposed to be about warring houses. I think it sounds like a Northlander a longboat, riding stormy seas on the way to raid some folk settlement. The rolling swell of the strings. Listen, you can hear the crash of waves over the prow in the cymbals. And have you heard The Pasha's Court, by the same composer? Oh, you can practically see the fire breathers. And the dancing girls, all colored silks and gold bracelets.
Fritha sighed, throwing herself backwards in her chair, clearly enjoying the scene behind her eyes, and Ari felt her stomach tighten. This was not fair. She would never be able to engage Herdalis like this, for the girl would always have the advantage, not only having studied such things but taking an incomparable joy in them too. Well, apart from the theatre, the elf reasoned, for though Fritha enjoyed the management of the playhouse, the girl herself had admitted to having no special love of acting. Ari felt her heart slow, a sudden weight settling over her. She had always quite liked the theatre, and though she had not attended a performance for years now, her father had taken her and her sisters regularly enough back in Faenia Dale. She recalled easily the girlish fantasies she had had of fluttering about the stage in the beautiful costumes, before her mother had shown her the true beauty of the weave and forever decided the path of her life. Ari swallowed, letting the bard's gaze upon the girl strengthen her resolve. Frithha focused on the dark red of her eyelids, listening to the music that drifted about her head and wishing more than ever that she still had her lute. When had she last heard a piece of music? A proper composition, and not the usual banal rubbish played by every group of minstrels between there and the gate. At least she was spared such in the coronet, Lady Nan clearly deciding there was more than enough entertainment provided by the brothel upstairs. As for the last piece she had heard, it must have been Candlekeep. Most of the sages there could play an instrument, though reluctantly, and special occasions would find a dozen or so gathered in the great hall or temple, these renditions technically perfect from what she could tell of it, but few of the sages shared her appreciation of music and there had been little joy in the performances. Frithha smiled. Not that she could complain, her own studies comprised of little more than her, Beth and the score. The two sat down in the kitchens either side of the great scrub table, singing the parts out together and trying to build the peace between them. Frithha felt herself frown, the music drifting away to be replaced with the low rumble of the tavern about her. She had not thought on any of this for so long, not since she had left Candlekeep really, such thoughts slowly buried under more pressing matters with no one to remind her of them until now. Perhaps it was just that he shared her interest, but somehow Herr Dallas seemed to bring it all to the fore until she felt alive with it as she had back at the keep, the compositions suddenly as clear in her mind as when she had first heard them. Frithha kept her eyes closed, listening to his voice, clear above the din of the tavern, and the sound made her smile.
"And what of you, Ari? Do you share our raven's love of music?"
The elf's voice, soft and wistful, and Frithha could almost see the waves of her hair dance as she shook her head.
"Oh, me? No, you Ripple, my sister, had the talent there."
Her voice trailed off and Frithha sensed the bard turn, sensed he was about to speak again when.
But, I was always quite interested in acting."
Frithha straightened so quickly she almost threw her back out, staring open-mouthed at Ari, who was suddenly very interested in the contents of her cup. "What?"
"Why, my dove,"
came the bard, sounding as surprised as Frithha felt, though infinitely more pleased by this revelation.
"I did not know you had aspirations of the thespian bent."
"You and me both, mate." Ari kept her eyes fixed in her cup, her voice quiet but resolved as she continued.
Oh yes, my mother always said I could have been quite the actress. I would have dreams of tripping onto the stage of the great theatre in Faenia Dale, the city I am from."
She sighed gently, finally raising her eyes to the man.
"But, such a thing is impossible now."
But Herr Dallas was having none of this, his face aglow with a sudden enthusiasm.
"That dream perhaps, but what of here and now? You would light up any stage, my dove. Why, we even have a theatre at our disposal."
He beamed, glancing to her, and Frithha sent him a quelling glare. No one messed about with her theatre. Ari shook her head though, the tremble of the golden tresses that framed her face just as pretty as Frithha had imagined.
"Oh, but Herr Dallas, I do not know how, I couldn't."
Frithha felt her eyes narrow. Such modest enticing refusals, Ari was a better actress than she gave herself credit for. Herr Dallas was certainly enjoying the performance, throwing an arm about her to give her a slightly condescending smile.
"Nonsense, my dove, acting comes from talent deep within you, one which you have in abundance, and I shall help you draw it out, if you wish."
The elf smiled, bright and true, and Frithha felt her heart sink.
"Oh, Herr Dallas, that would be wonderful.
But Fritha could hardly agree and, it seemed, neither did Nalia, the girl looking no less than livid, eyes dark beneath the line of her brow as she nodded imperceptibly to the bar and the girls rose together.
I think we could all use some more wine, don't you?
Came Fritha brightly, and before any reply could be given, they had turned as one and escaped into the crowds.
Ari wants to act,
hissed Nalia as soon as they were safely hidden in the press of patrons waiting to be served.
Like what, an adult?
Fritha just sighed, turning her face as she was pressed closer to the girl, the man behind her elbowing his way out from the bar and trying desperately not to spill the drinks he had just ordered.
Have you ever heard Ari mention anything about wanted to become an actress before now?
Nalia shook her head, cold and slow.
No, I have not. And I will warrant the only reason she is suddenly mentioning it now was to distract Herr Dallas from looking at you. He was looking at me.
Fritha repeated with amazement, her melancholy no more than a memory as she found herself suddenly unable to stop grinning.
Like how?
Nalia sent her a gentle smile.
Like Lyra had suddenly appeared in the chair opposite him. You should see yourself when you get carried away like that, though I imagine your talk of music will hardly have the same effect now he's caught up teaching Ari how to become an actress, not that she needs any lessons.
The girl added crossly.
Can't you become suddenly stage-struck as well?
Fritha scowled.
And win him with false dice? What would be the point? I want him to like me, not some character I've made up.
She snapped, sending a frown to the elf through the press, the girl currently laughing at something, looking warm and enchanting, and Fritha sighed, her anger suddenly gone, shaking her head as though to scatter the jealousy from it.
Ugh, why is this making such a monster of me? I can't believe Ari is acting with any malice, I don't want to believe it.
Nalia just frowned though.
Well, you are more generous than I would be.
Fritha snorted humorlessly.
Yes, well, all's fair. Look, I understand that you don't like Herr Dallas much, but why are you being so hard on Ari? It can't be because she likes him because, well...
The girl trailed off with a vague gesture to herself and Nalia smiled sadly.
No, you are correct. It is not because she likes him, though I do think you are both complete idiots for doing so.
She added, with a burst of temper, and Fritha nodded, smiling slightly.
Duly noted.
Nalia smiled as well, sighing deeply as she continued.
But Ari, before I told you we were friends, good friends, or so I thought. Well, I've never had a real friend before. I mean there were girls at school and such, but they were more relationships of circumstance than true friendships, and I did not stay in touch with any of them once I had left. But Ari. I truly liked her and we seemed to get on so well, every evening spent together. I thought we had something special, that, oh, I don't know.
She finished with a frustrated sigh.
I soon found out how wrong I was though. She couldn't wait to drop me for that bard.
Fritha sent her a gentle smile. The friend pushed out for the new courtship, she knew that role well enough.
Just because she likes Herr Dallas doesn't mean she isn't your friend,
Fritha reasoned, but Nalia would not be soothed.
Oh, no? Then why, since he has arrived, has it been you acting like one, not she?
Fritha opened her mouth to answer, but the girl continued before she could think of a reply, looking fair and fierce in her sincerity.
You are my friend, Fritha, and I will not see you lose to Ari in this, however unsuitable I think Herr Dallas is, and that is why you must fight for him.
Fritha took a step back, suddenly worried by what Nalia was implying and muttering an apology as she knocked into the woman behind her.
Nalia, I am doing everything I can. What do you want me to do, march over there and call her out? No, do not be so obtuse, Fritha.
Nalia replied tersely, her voice wavering between irritation and laughter, the girl fixing her with a sly look as she continued.
But there are other, more subtle ways of going about things. I know we were only joking before, but there would be no harm in changing into the tunic we embroidered. Nalia, are you mad?
Fritha snapped, angry at the sense the girl was making. This wasn't how it was supposed to be.
I'm not changing my clothes or anything else for that matter.
She continued, folding her arms stubbornly, he should like me just as I am. But Nalia merely put her hands on her hips with a determined frown, the man behind her looking as though he would ask her to move over, before he seemed to think better of it.
Well, yes, he should, and in an ideal world he would as well. But we are both aware that this is not such a place, and in situations like this, presentation can be as important as character.
Fritha sighed and nodded glumly, arms falling defeatedly to her sides.
I understand what you mean, the one who can catch his eye is more likely to catch something else as well. But I can't help it, I still feel how I feel. If he truly liked me, then it wouldn't matter if Ari was the most beautiful woman in and was pursuing him with the ferocity of a hungry lioness, and let's face it.
She quipped with a wry smile,
it's not far off in either case. Ari's no prettier than you.
Nalia snapped, and looking so adamant Fritha didn't dare refute it.
Well,
Fritha continued after a moment's wary pause,
either way, if he likes me, then it should be regardless of anyone else. That's a very naive way of looking at it,
said Nalia, her voice suddenly soft, and Fritha shook her head with a tired smile.
I know, my mind is old and knows it doesn't usually work like that, but my heart is still young and that's how it feels. Look at them.
She sighed, gazing over to where the pair were still sat, heads leaned in close as they talked, the table already covered in tattered scripts, while Anoman and Minsk had retreated to a conversation between themselves.
Why don't I just give up now and spare myself some bother?
A shout and the smash of bottles from the bar behind them, and Herr Dallas glanced up, finding her in the throng to send her a smile, Fritha hiding her grin in her sleeve as her stomach lurched, and Nalia laughed gently.
I believe you have your reason.
End of chapter.